The woman lay in the dark alley, blood slowly seeping across the cold pavement, and Audrey had almost walked right past her. Just 3 more steps. Just ignoring that faint, broken moan in the dark. Just keeping on toward home the way she did after every overtime shift. If she'd done that, this story would never have happened, and neither would the life that came after it. Chicago that night was bitter enough to cut the skin, the kind of cold that sank into bone, the kind that made you drop your head and hurry. The sky was a solid sheet of black, with not a single star. December wind screamed between the worn old buildings on the south side. Audrey pulled her thin coat tight around herself and moved through the familiar alley she'd walked hundreds of times. She was tired. She was hungry. She was drained to the marrow. In her pocket, she had exactly $52, money meant for pain medication for her grandmother, who was lying in a hospital bed. 18 hours on her feet in the emergency department. 18 hours without eating, without sitting, without resting. A shift from hell, finally over, and she still had to walk home because she couldn't afford a taxi, and the last bus had been gone for hours. Audrey Bennett, 28 years old, a nurse, graduated with honors, worked like a slave, and still poor as dirt. Life kept doing this to her, year after year. She tried. She tried with everything she had, and it was never enough. She lowered her head and hurried through the alley, and then she heard it, a moan, thin and weak, like an injured cat. But it wasn't a cat. Audrey stopped, her heart cinched tight. She looked toward the darkness behind a trash bin. At first, she thought it was a garbage bag. Then she saw a hand, a human hand. Audrey ran to her. The woman was lying there, turned on her side, her back against the cold brick wall. Her clothes were expensive but disheveled, torn. Silver hair had come loose, spilling over a pale face. Blood from a wound on her head ran down her cheek, down her throat, and onto the filthy alley floor. Her lips were blue. Her breathing came in broken pulls, weakening by the second. Audrey dropped to her knees, the nurse in her taking over. She pressed 2 fingers to the woman's neck. The pulse was there, thread thin, but it was there. She was still alive. Audrey grabbed her phone and called 911. The voice on the other end was flat, almost bored. Southside. The wait time for an ambulance is at least 40 minutes. 40 minutes. The woman would be dead before anyone arrived. In that moment, fear crashed in. Audrey glanced around the black mouth of the alley. The attacker could still be here. She was a woman, alone, unarmed. She could be in danger. She could get dragged into something. She could just leave. She'd called the police, hadn't she? They would come. It wasn't her problem. But something stronger than fear rose in her chest. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. Audrey, never step over someone who needs help, because one day, it might be you who needs someone to stop. She couldn't leave her here. Audrey pulled off her coat and wrapped it around the woman's head to slow the bleeding. She slid an arm beneath the woman's back and tried to lift her. The body was heavier than she expected, or maybe she was simply too exhausted. But she still stood up. She still moved forward, step by step, staggering through the cutting cold. Her breath came fast. Her muscles shook. Her mind screamed at her to stop, but her heart wouldn't listen. Street, Mary's hospital was a 15-minute walk from there, with a dying woman on her back. 15 minutes felt like 15 years. Audrey didn't know that the person fading against her shoulder was Catherine Blackwood, the mother of Adrian Blackwood, the Mafia boss who terrified all of Chicago. She didn't know that on the other side of the city, the most powerful man in Chicago was tearing the world apart to find his mother. She didn't know that when their 2 worlds collided, nothing would ever be the same. Audrey knew only one thing. Someone needed saving, and that small act was about to change everything. This story is long. It's full of surprises, full of tears, and full of moments that will make your heart break open. If you want to walk with Audrey to the end of the road, press the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. Like this video if you believe kindness is repaid, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Because sometimes, one story really can change an entire life. Audrey sat on the icy plastic chair outside the emergency room, her hands still smeared with the blood of a stranger. The clock on the wall read 3:30 in the morning. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the steady beep of machines drifted out from behind the closed door. She'd been sitting there for more than an hour now, since the doctors had rushed Catherine's gurney into emergency surgery. A severe concussion and a deep scalp laceration, they'd said. Significant blood loss. Surgery immediately to close the wound and check for internal pressure. Audrey had nodded like a machine and signed the consent form because there was no one else here. No one knew who the woman was. No one came looking for her. Only Audrey, a broke nurse with $52 in her pocket, sitting here praying for a stranger. She closed her eyes, and memory crashed over her like floodwater. 16 years earlier, Audrey was 12. That day was a Saturday, 1 week before the school performance. Little Audrey had begged her mother to take her to buy a new pair of shoes. Margaret, her mother, had just gotten off a night shift at the factory, dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep, yet she still smiled and nodded. "All right, my little princess, I'll take you." They got in the car. Audrey sat in the back seat, legs swinging, singing under her breath. Margaret drove, turning now and then to smile at her daughter. Then everything happened too fast. Blinding headlights, the shriek of a truck horn, metal slamming into metal, glass shattering, then silence. When Audrey woke up in the hospital, she asked where her mother was. No one answered. They only looked at her with pity. Then Ruth arrived, pulled her into her arms, and sobbed. "Your mom's gone, Audrey. Your mom's gone." In the days that followed, Audrey heard adults whispering. If the girl hadn't insisted on buying shoes that day, if Margaret hadn't indulged her, poor thing, orphaned at only 12, those words sank into her heart like knives. Audrey began to believe she'd killed her mother. Every night she clutched her pillow and cried, calling for her mother in dreams, then waking with the pillow soaked through with tears. Ruth tried to heal the wound inside her granddaughter. She held Audrey and said it wasn't your fault. But Audrey didn't believe her. She never did. On the first anniversary of her mother's death, Audrey stood at the grave, 13 years old, thin and ghost pale. She knelt down and laid her hand on the cold headstone. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I asked to go that day. I'm sorry you died instead of me." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I promise you, I'll save as many people as I can. I'll never leave anyone behind. Never." That was why she became a nurse. That was why she worked 18 hours a day without complaining. That was why she couldn't leave Catherine in the dark alley tonight. The operating room door opened, yanking Audrey back to the present. She shot to her feet, her heart pounding. The doctor stepped out, pulled down his mask, his face exhausted but his eyes relieved. "Are you the one who brought her in?" Audrey nodded. "She's out of immediate danger. We stopped the bleeding and relieved the intracranial pressure. But there's a problem." Audrey held her breath. She has temporary memory loss. It could be the trauma. It could be shock. She doesn't remember who she is, doesn't remember her family, doesn't remember what happened. "We don't know her name." The doctor looked at Audrey. "Do you know who she is?" Audrey shook her head. "I found her in an alley. She had no identification, no phone. I don't know who she is." The hospital registered Catherine under the name Jane Doe, an unidentified woman. No insurance, no family, no one came to claim her. Audrey stood outside the recovery room and looked through the glass. The woman lay there with bandages wrapped around her head, her face pale, breathing in an even rhythm with the help of machines. A stranger. But Audrey had made a promise at her mother's grave 16 years ago. She wouldn't leave anyone behind. "Ma'am," Audrey whispered through the glass, "I don't know who you are, but someone's looking for you. I promise I'll stay here until you remember everything." At the same time, on the other side of the city, in a grand mansion on the North Shore, Adrian Blackwood shattered the third table of the night. His mother had been missing for 6 hours, and someone was going to pay. The Blackwood mansion sat in silence on the North Shore, where the wealthiest people in Chicago lived. Inside his dark study, lit only by the fire in the hearth, Adrian Blackwood sat motionless in a leather chair, one hand around a glass of whiskey that had gone cold long ago. 36 years old. Steel gray eyes, a faint scar running from his temple down to his cheekbone like a reminder of a blood-soaked past. On the desk, among files and documents, there was only a single photograph. A picture of his mother, Catherine Blackwood, taken on her 63rd birthday. She was smiling, the gentle smile Adrian loved more than anything in the world. The door flew open. Bruno Marchetti, Adrian's right hand for 20 years, stepped in with a face gone pale. Bruno had never looked that pale. "Boss," Bruno said, his voice shaking, "something's happened. Mrs. Catherine. Her car was attacked on the way back from the cemetery. The driver is dead. She's missing. The whiskey glass slipped from Adrian's hand and shattered on the floor. He didn't feel the sting when a shard of glass cut his skin. He felt only the blood in his body turning to ice. What? One word. Cold as winter. Bruno swallowed. We found the car 3 miles from the cemetery. It was rammed. The driver was shot. Mrs. Catherine wasn't there. No trace. Adrian stood, walked out of the mansion, got into his car, and tore toward the scene. His mother's black Mercedes lay on the roadside, the front end crushed, the windows blown out. The police had been bought, kept the scene untouched for him. Adrian climbed into the car and sat down in the back seat where his mother always sat. The familiar scent of her perfume still lingered. On the floor, he saw the embroidered handkerchief he'd given her last year. It was soaked with blood. Adrian picked it up, his hand trembling. He pulled out his phone and dialed his mother. It rang, and rang. No answer. "Mom," Adrian whispered into the emptiness. "Where are you?" And memory surged up, cruel and razor-sharp. 22 years earlier, Adrian was 14. That night, he'd been doing homework in his room when he heard gunshots. He ran down the stairs and saw his father, Edward Blackwood, the most powerful boss in Chicago at the time, sprawled on the floor. Blood poured from his chest, spreading across the white marble. His mother, Catherine, was on her knees beside him, screaming, trying to press her bare hands over the wound. And the man holding the gun stood there, face like ice. Frank Moretti, his father's right hand, the man his father trusted most. "Why?" Edward asked, blood bubbling at his lips. Moretti smiled. "For money, Edward. It's that simple." Then he fired again. Edward Blackwood died in front of his son. Catherine pulled Adrian against her, covered the boy's eyes. But he'd already seen everything. His father's blood, the traitor's smile, his mother's desperate sobs. From that night on, Adrian Blackwood was no longer a 14-year-old boy who laughed easily. He became the man all of Chicago feared. He built an empire from his father's ashes, cold and ruthless, yet holding one vow at the center of his heart: protect his mother at any cost. And now, his mother was missing. Adrian stepped out of the car, his eyes bloodshot but dry. He'd forgotten how to cry 22 years ago. Bruno waited outside with 20 other men, all of them silent, all of them waiting for orders. "Mobilize everyone," Adrian said, his voice low as thunder. 200 men. Search every street in Chicago. Pull every security camera, every hospital, every morgue. Call our police. Find her. Bruno nodded. And Moretti? Adrian turned, and his eyes were no longer cold. They burned like hell. Investigate whether he's behind this. If he is, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Everyone understood. In the hours that followed, Chicago sank into a silent storm. Adrian's people appeared everywhere, from the darkest alleys to the richest neighborhoods. Security footage was accessed. Witnesses were questioned. The underground information network was activated. But there was no sign of Catherine. She was as if she'd evaporated from the earth. Then, Bruno brought information that made Adrian grit his teeth. "Boss, we found out Mrs. Catherine dismissed her security on her own. She wanted to visit Mr. Edwards' grave alone. She's done it many times before, but this time, Adrian drove his fist into the wall, cracking the plaster. His mother hated being guarded. She often said, "I'm a prisoner in my own home." He knew that. But he hadn't thought she'd risk something like this, and now she was out there somewhere, maybe hurt, maybe bleeding, maybe calling his name while he couldn't hear her. Adrian stood at the office window and looked out over Chicago in the rising dawn. Somewhere out there, his mother was waiting. Alive or dead, he didn't know. But he knew one thing. "Anyone who touched my mother," Adrian said into the darkness, his voice a curse dragged up from hell, "will beg to die." He didn't know that miles away, in the poor St. Mary's Hospital on the south side, his mother was lying in a hospital bed, and the person who had saved her, the person who had carried her through the cutting cold, was only a thin young nurse with $52 in her pocket. 2 weeks had passed since that fateful night. Catherine was out of immediate danger, but her memory was still a blank sheet of paper. She remembered her first name was Catherine. Nothing more. No last name. No home. No sense that anyone was searching for her. Street. Mary's Hospital couldn't keep her forever. No insurance, no identification, no family member coming to claim her. The bill had climbed to more than $8,000, and the hospital had started pressing. Audrey stood at the front desk, pulled out the last of her savings, the money she'd been putting aside to buy Ruth's medication this month. She placed it on the counter and said, in a voice that sounded strangely calm, "I'll take her to my place. I know it isn't ideal, but it's better than her being discharged to a public shelter in this state, until she remembers everything." Audrey's apartment was on the 5th floor of an old building with no elevator, on the south side, the part of Chicago people called the Forgotten Zone. She helped Catherine up each flight of stairs, Catherine still weak after surgery. When Audrey opened the door, shame rose in her throat. The room was only 25 square meters. The walls were stained with damp and mold, the paint peeling off in sheets. The heater had been broken for 2 years. In winter, she survived with a few thin blankets against the cold. Tape lined the window to keep the wind from slipping in. One narrow bed, one small table, a mini fridge that hummed day and night. That was everything Audrey had. Catherine looked around the room, and Audrey saw something flicker in her eyes. Not disgust, not pity, pain. Even without knowing who she was, Catherine could feel the difference. She knew she didn't belong here, but she said nothing. She only took Audrey's hand and smiled. "You opened your door to a stranger. This is the most beautiful place I've ever seen." Audrey almost cried at those words. In the days that followed, they learned how to live together. Audrey gave Catherine the bed and slept on the battered old chair in the corner. She worked night shifts at the hospital, came home to care for Catherine, then went back again. They shared plain meals, canned soup, bread, sometimes nothing but white rice porridge with a pinch of salt. Catherine never complained. She even insisted on helping Audrey with the housework, even when Audrey tried to stop her. Once, Catherine tried to use the gas stove to boil water, but she didn't know how to light it. Audrey had to show her, and they laughed together, a rare sound in the cold little room. Catherine said, "I don't remember who I am, but I'm sure there's no gas stove in my home." Audrey laughed. "I'm guessing your house has a private chef." Catherine tilted her head, thinking, then shook it. "I don't remember, but it could be." They talked more. Catherine spoke about scattered fragments of memory. A large house, a man she loved, a deep sorrow she couldn't explain. Audrey talked about Ruth, about nursing, about the nights she cried alone because she was so tired. They began to cling to each other like mother and daughter, even though they'd known each other for less than a week. Then the 5th night came. Audrey was dozing on the chair when she jolted awake. There was a sound at the door, a soft scraping, like someone clawing at the wood. Her heart seized. Catherine's attacker. They'd found her. They were here. Audrey rose silently, went to the kitchenette, and took the biggest knife she owned. She stood behind the door with both hands wrapped around the handle, her body shaking, barely daring to breathe. Catherine slept on the bed, unaware. The sound continued, then stopped, then started again. Audrey stood there all night, eyes fixed on the door, not closing them for a second. If someone came in, she would fight. She would protect this woman at any cost. Dawn light slipped through the edge of the window. Audrey opened the door, the knife still in her hand, and she saw it. A skinny stray cat, dirty gray fur, curled up on the floor in front of her apartment. It looked up at Audrey with hungry eyes and let out a weak meow. Audrey lowered the knife, sank down, and laughed, laughing with tears. She'd stayed awake all night because of a cat, but the fear was still there. Someone had attacked Catherine. Someone could come back, and Audrey knew she couldn't protect her forever. Inside the room, Catherine had woken up. She stared out the window, and shards of memory began to flash behind her eyes. A man's face, gray eyes, a scar, a name, Adrian. She didn't remember clearly yet, but she knew that somewhere out there, someone was looking for her. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful night in the dark alley. Catherine sat on the worn chair by the window, helping Audrey fold the laundry that had just dried. It had become their routine every afternoon, right before Audrey left for her night shift. In the corner of the room, the small television was running the evening news, the sound slipping through like background noise that neither of them really heard, until the anchor's voice landed on a phrase that made Catherine freeze in place. The mysterious disappearance of an upper-class Chicago woman remains unsolved after 3 weeks. Police refuse to release the victim's identity at the family's request, but sources say she's a member of a powerful North Shore family. Her private driver died at the scene. If anyone has information, please call the hotline. No photo, no name, but the description of a black Mercedes, the location near Rose Hill Cemetery, the timing 3 weeks ago, everything matched perfectly. Catherine let the shirt slip from her fingers, and memory came roaring back like a tidal wave. She remembered everything: the cemetery, Edward's grave, her husband, the man she loved who had died 22 years earlier. She'd slipped away from her security to visit him alone, the way she always did whenever she needed silence. On the way back, the car was hit. The crunch of metal, the crack of gunfire, the driver collapsing over the steering wheel. She'd forced the door, crawled out, and ran into the nearest alley. But they chased her. She saw the attacker's face, cold and ruthless. Victor Crane, the trusted enforcer of Frank Moretti, the man who had killed her husband 22 years ago. He caught her, knocked her to the ground, and stripped her purse and phone. "Hello, Mrs. Blackwood," he said with a vicious smile. "Send my regards to your son." Then he kicked her in the head, and darkness swallowed everything. Catherine Blackwood, widow of Edward Blackwood, mother of Adrian Blackwood, the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago. She trembled, tears streaming down her cheeks. Audrey rushed to her and wrapped her in her arms. "Mrs. Catherine, what is it? Did you remember something?" Catherine looked up at the young woman with those worried eyes, the girl who had saved her life, cared for her for 10 days, shared every plain meal with her. She had to tell the truth. "Audrey," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "I remember now. I know who I am. I'm Catherine Blackwood." Audrey frowned. "Blackwood?" Catherine nodded, tears still falling. "Adrian Blackwood's mother. People call my son the Mafia boss of Chicago." Audrey took a step back, as if she'd been shocked by electricity. Blackwood. In Chicago, everyone knew that name. The papers called them the most powerful family in the city. People whispered about bloody hits, about an underground empire that controlled Chicago itself. And Audrey had sheltered the Mafia boss's mother for the past 20 days. She pulled out her phone and typed Catherine Blackwood Chicago into the search bar with trembling fingers. The result appeared immediately. A photograph from last year's charity event. Catherine Blackwood, 63 years old, widow of the late businessman Edward Blackwood, mother of Adrian Blackwood, chairman of Blackwood Group. The woman in the photo was smiling softly, wearing an elegant evening gown, silver hair pinned up with aristocratic grace. It was the same woman sitting here, in Audrey's 25-square-meter room, wearing the old sweater Audrey had lent her. Audrey went pale. She'd saved the mother of a Mafia boss. She'd sheltered her in her home. She knew too much. In the world of people like the Blackwoods, knowing too much often meant death. Catherine saw the fear in Audrey's eyes. She understood. She took Audrey's hand, her voice grave. "Audrey, listen to me. You saved my life. But if Moretti finds out you helped me, you'll be in danger. You should stay away. Forget me. Pretend you never met me." Audrey looked at the woman in front of her. Catherine wasn't only the Mafia boss's mother. She was the woman who'd laughed with Audrey while learning how to use a gas stove. She was the woman who'd held Audrey's hand when Audrey talked about her mother. She was the woman who'd eaten canned soup with her without complaining once. She was a stranger who had become family in 10 short days. "You're not a bad person," Audrey said, her voice shaking but firm. "Whatever your son does, that's not you." "I'm not leaving you," Catherine cried. She pulled Audrey into her arms, the way she would have held the daughter she'd never had. "I'll call Adrian," she said. "My son will come for me. And I promise, I won't let anyone hurt you." She borrowed Audrey's phone, her hand shaking as she dialed the only number she still knew by heart. It rang. Once. Twice. Then someone picked up. Silence on the other end. Catherine spoke, her voice breaking. "Adrian, it's Mom." On the other end, the silence stretched like a century. Then a voice came through, trembling, shattered, no longer cold the way it usually was. "Mom?" 45 minutes after the call, the poor street on the south side suddenly sank into darkness. 15 glossy black SUVs rolled in nose to tail and packed the whole block. Vehicles worth many times more than Audrey's apartment. 30 men in black suits stepped out and formed a line like a wall of steel, their eyes sweeping every window, every corner, every stretch of pavement. Audrey's neighbors watched through cracked doors, whispering to one another in fear. The police never came to this neighborhood that fast. But this wasn't the police. This was something far more frightening than the police. The first vehicle's door opened. Adrian Blackwood stepped out. He wore his usual black suit, but today it was rumpled, as if he'd been in it for 3 straight weeks without changing. His beard was unshaven, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. His sharp face with the faint scar at his temple looked more hollow than it ever had. Yet even at his worst, Adrian still carried a kind of power that made people lower their heads. He didn't speak. He walked straight into the old building and took the stairs 4 at a time. Bruno and 2 others hurried after him, but Adrian was faster than all of them. He couldn't wait 1 more second. Audrey stood inside the apartment, her heart hammering as heavy footsteps hit the hallway. Then the door burst open. Adrian stood there, chest rising and falling from climbing too fast, his gaze sweeping the miserable little room before it locked onto the woman by the window, Catherine, his mother. Her head was still wrapped in bandages, her body thinner after 10 days, but she was standing there, alive, breathing. Mom. 1 word, just one, but it held every sleepless night, every nightmare, every fear Adrian had kept caged for 10 days. He stepped forward, then he ran, then he crashed into her and held her the way a lost child holds home after finally finding the way back. Catherine wrapped her arms around her son and stroked his hair the way she had when he was small. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm safe now. I'm sorry I made you worry." And the impossible happened. Adrian Blackwood, the Mafia boss Chicago feared, the man who had forgotten how to cry 22 years ago, was crying, his tears soaked into his mother's shoulder, the first tears since the day his father fell into a pool of blood. Bruno and the others stood outside the doorway, no one daring to step in. They had never seen Adrian like this. They hadn't even known he could cry. "I thought I'd lost you," Adrian said, his voice breaking. 20 days, Mom. I turned Chicago upside down and I couldn't find you." "I thought you had." He couldn't finish. He didn't dare say it. Catherine took his face in her hands and wiped his tears the way she used to. "I'm here. I'm alive. Because of her." She turned her head toward Audrey, and only then did Adrian see her for the first time. She stood tucked into the corner, as if she were trying to make herself as small as possible. Jeans torn at the knee, an old sweater worn thin at the shoulders, brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail, a narrow face with dark circles beneath sleepless eyes. She looked like she hadn't eaten a proper meal in years, but her back was straight, and when their eyes met, she didn't look down. She stared right at Adrian. No fear, no flinching. Adrian was used to people fearing him. Everyone feared him. But this girl, this thin young woman in this shabby apartment, didn't shake. He walked toward her, the instinctive suspicion that lived in his blood rising to the surface. "Who are you?" His voice turned cold again, sharp as a blade. Catherine started to speak, but Adrian went on. "Everyone wants something. Money, power, protection. What do you want? Say it. How much?" Audrey looked at the man in front of her. This was the Mafia boss the newspapers wrote about. This was the man all of Chicago feared. This was Adrian Blackwood. But she had also just watched him cry in his mother's arms like a child. She took a deep breath. "I'm Audrey Bennett, a nurse. I found Mrs. Catherine in an alley 10 days ago. I brought her to the hospital. I took care of her when she had amnesia, and I don't want anything." Adrian gave a short, hard laugh. "No one is good for free." Audrey felt her heart hammering against her ribs, the sheer weight of his presence almost suffocating her. Every instinct screamed at her to look away, but her pride rose up like a shield to mask the terror. She wouldn't let him reduce her life's values to a business transaction. Audrey didn't move. "Then you haven't met enough decent people." That sentence stopped Adrian cold. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a threat to be measured, but as a person. Catherine stepped forward and took Audrey's hand. "She's telling the truth, Adrian. She used her last savings to pay for my hospital care. She went hungry so I could eat. She slept on the chair so I could have the bed. 20 days, my son. 20 days she cared for a stranger and asked for nothing." Adrian didn't speak. He only nodded at Audrey, a small gesture, reluctant, but no longer icy. Then he helped his mother to the door. Catherine turned back and hugged Audrey one last time. "We'll see each other again, I promise." The black convoy drove away, leaving Audrey standing alone in the empty room. She looked at the chair where Catherine had been sitting, looked at the bed where she had been lying, and the room felt colder than it ever had. In the SUV rolling back toward the North Shore, Adrian stared out the window, watching the old building fade behind them. Who is she that Mom trusts her like that? He asked Bruno. Bruno shook his head. I don't know, boss. But she's different. Adrian didn't answer. He was asking himself the same thing. 3 days after Catherine left, Audrey's life began to change in strange ways she couldn't explain. That morning, she went to St. Mary's to visit Ruth the way she always did. Her grandmother had been in the hospital for more than 2 months with late-stage cancer, the medical bills piling up like a mountain, and Audrey had been picking up extra shifts just to pay it off $1 at a time. But when she stopped at the front desk to ask about this month's payment, the nurse on duty looked at her with open surprise. Miss Bennett, your grandmother's bill has been paid. All of it. $187,000. Audrey thought she'd misheard. Who paid it? The nurse shook her head. Anonymous. They only asked that we not disclose the name. Audrey stood there, the world spinning. $187,000. Money she might not earn in a lifetime. Who could pay that for a stranger? But she already knew the answer. There was only one person. When Audrey got back to her apartment, she realized everything was different. The heater was running, the room warm for the first time in 2 years. The windows had been replaced, no gaps left for wind to slip through. The refrigerator, when she opened it for a glass of water, was suddenly full of food. The kind of food she had never dared to buy because it cost too much. Fresh meat, vegetables, milk, eggs, fruit, and on the table, there was a black envelope. Audrey picked it up, her hands trembling. Inside were $20,000 in cash, stacked neatly in bundles, along with a black business card that held only one thing, an address. Blackwood Tower, 50th floor. Audrey sat down and stared at the money in front of her. $20,000, more than 2 years of her wages. With that money, she could clear her debts. She could rest. She could buy Ruth the best of everything. Part of her wanted to take it, to accept the gift and keep living. But another part of her, the part her mother had taught her when she was little, the part Ruth had nurtured for 16 years, was shouting in her head. A debt of money can be repaid. A debt of kindness can last a lifetime. She hadn't saved Catherine for money. She'd saved her because it was the right thing to do. If she took this, her act would turn into a transaction, and Audrey Bennett didn't sell her kindness. That afternoon, Audrey stood in front of Blackwood Tower and looked up at the 50 stories of glass and steel. She walked into the lobby, the envelope gripped tight in her hand. The security guard looked her up and down, contempt plain on his face when he saw her worn clothes. What do you need? Audrey lifted her chin. I need to see Mr. Adrian Blackwood. The guard gave a sharp, amused snort. Do you have an appointment? No. Then you can't go up. Audrey didn't flinch. Tell him Audrey Bennett is here to return his money. The guard started to refuse, but Bruno appeared from somewhere nearby and gave a small nod. Let her up. The elevator carried Audrey to the 50th floor. The doors opened, and she stepped into a different world. Adrian's office was larger than her entire apartment. Glass walls overlooking all of Chicago, interiors of expensive oak and black leather. Adrian sat behind his desk, late afternoon sunlight catching the scar on his face. He watched her walk in, gray eyes giving nothing away. Audrey crossed the room and set the envelope on his desk. I'm giving it back. Adrian frowned. Why? I didn't save your mother for money, Audrey said, her voice calm but unyielding. I saved her because it was the right thing to do. If I take this, it turns what I did into a transaction, and I don't want that. Adrian stood and came around the desk, stopping close. He was nearly a head taller than she was, his shadow falling over her like it meant to swallow her whole. But Audrey didn't step back. This is my gratitude, Adrian said, his voice low and cold. You saved my mother's life. You deserve to be repaid. Audrey shook her head. You already paid my grandmother's bill, $187,000. That's more than enough. I don't need anything else. Adrian looked at her as if she were something not quite human. In his 36 years, no one had ever refused his money. No one. You're foolish, he said. Audrey smiled, small and steady, not afraid at all. Maybe. But I sleep at night. She turned and walked out of his office without waiting for his reaction. The door closed behind her. Adrian stood there, staring at the envelope on his desk, then at the door that had just shut. Bruno stepped in and asked quietly, Boss, what's wrong with her? Adrian didn't answer. For the first time in years, someone had made him genuinely curious. 1 week after Audrey returned the $20,000 to Adrian, She was called into the manager's office at St. Mary's Hospital. The department head sat behind the desk, her face hard as money, not meeting Audrey's eyes as she spoke. "Miss Bennett, in the past month you've taken too many days off. We understand your situation, but the hospital can't continue like this. We have to let you go." Audrey felt as if someone had just punched her in the chest. "But I only took a few days to care for an emergency patient. I've worked here for 5 years. I've never missed a shift, never been late." The department head sighed. "I know, Miss Bennett, but the hospital is cutting staff. The budget is tight, and you have the least seniority in the department." Audrey understood. She understood very clearly. The hospital needed a reason to fire someone, and the days she'd taken off to care for Catherine were the perfect excuse. She was the easiest target. No powerful family, no connections, no one to protect her, just a poor nurse no one would remember once she was gone. Audrey walked out of the hospital like a woman without a soul. Snow was falling, white flakes settling on the thin shoulders of her coat, but she didn't feel cold. She didn't feel anything. Her feet carried her without direction through familiar streets, until she realized she was sitting on a stone bench in the small park near her apartment. No one else was around, only her and the falling snow. Then everything hit her at once. No job meant no money. No money meant she couldn't pay rent. She couldn't buy Ruth's medicine. She couldn't take care of the only family she had left. Audrey had tried. She had tried for 16 years, since her mother died. She'd studied hard, worked without stopping, endured every hardship without a single complaint. She had done everything the right way, and life still wouldn't let her go. Tears began to fall. Audrey cried, the sound raw in the empty park. "Mom," she whispered to the gray sky, I tried as hard as I could. Why is it still not enough? Why won't life give me one chance?" A hand settled on her shoulder. Leah, her closest coworker at the hospital, had run after her and caught up without her even noticing. Leah sat beside her, pulled Audrey into her arms, said nothing, simply held her while she cried until she had no tears left. "It's going to be okay," Leah said. "You'll find another job. You're the best nurse I know." Audrey wanted to believe that, but she knew reality was harsher than that. No one wanted to hire a nurse who'd just been fired. No one. At the same time, back at the Blackwood mansion, Catherine was calling Audrey the way she always did. She'd stayed in contact with the young woman all week, calling every day to check on her. But today Audrey's voice was different, shaking, thick with tears. And when Catherine asked what was wrong, Audrey went quiet for a long time before she finally admitted it. "I lost my job, Mrs. Catherine." Catherine felt her heart tighten. "Stay right there. I'll help," Audrey blurted. "No, I don't need pity. I'll figure it out myself." Catherine shook her head even though Audrey couldn't see. "This isn't pity, Audrey. This is family." She set the phone down and went straight to Adrian's office. He was reading reports, but he looked up when he saw his mother enter with a serious expression. "The girl who saved my life just lost her job," Catherine said plainly. Adrian frowned. "And? Give her a job. Blackwood Medical Center needs nurses." Adrian set the report down and looked at his mother. "You want me to hire a stranger into my empire? You know how dangerous that is." Catherine stepped closer and held his gaze. "She isn't a stranger. She's our benefactor. She saved my life, took care of me for 10 days, and then refused the $20,000 you offered. In your entire life, how many people like that have you met?" Adrian fell silent. The answer was none. Not once. "You owe her, Adrian," Catherine said, her voice gentle but firm. "And my son, this is your chance to pay that debt." The next day, Bruno appeared at Audrey's apartment door with an envelope. Inside was a job offer from Blackwood Medical Center, the most luxurious private hospital in Chicago, one of the Blackwood family's legal businesses. The salary was double her old pay, night shift nursing position. Along with it was a handwritten note from Catherine. "This isn't charity. This is an opportunity you deserve. If you're good, you keep the job. If you aren't, you get fired like anyone else. Prove I was right to trust you." Audrey held the letter in her hands, and tears fell again. But this time they were tears of hope. She looked at Bruno and nodded. "Tell Mrs. Catherine I won't disappoint her." She didn't know that when she walked through the doors of Blackwood Medical Center, she was stepping into Adrian Blackwood's world, and that world was going to change her forever. 3 weeks had passed since the day Audrey first walked into Blackwood Medical Center. This hospital was nothing like St. Mary's, the place she'd worked for 5 years. Everything here was modern and lavish, from the marble-tiled corridors to the most expensive medical equipment she'd never even been allowed to touch before. The patients here were Chicago's upper class, people who could pay tens of thousands of dollars for a single night in a hospital bed without a second thought. And her co-workers, they looked at her with suspicion from the very first day. She got in here through connections, they whispered behind her back. There's definitely something between her and the Blackwood family. Audrey heard every word and said nothing. She kept her head down and worked, harder than anyone else, proving she deserved to be here, and she proved it. After 3 weeks, no one could deny Audrey's ability. She moved fast and sure, precise, always willing to take an extra shift when someone else needed time off. She treated every patient the same, from wealthy businessmen to the housekeepers their employers brought in for checkups. Slowly, her co-workers' suspicious looks shifted into reluctant respect. But Audrey didn't care about that. She still lived in her old apartment on the south side, still saved every dollar, still took the bus to work every day. Her pay was higher, but she poured it into Ruth's care. Catherine came to the hospital often under the excuse of routine checkups, but really it was to see Audrey. They ate lunch together in the staff cafeteria, talking like mother and daughter. Catherine told her about Adrian, about the boy who used to laugh, about how he changed after his father died. "My son wasn't born cold," she said, her eyes distant with sadness. "When he was little, he laughed all the time. He loved reading, loved drawing, loved running through the garden chasing butterflies. Then his father died. And my son's smile died with him." Audrey listened without speaking, but she began to understand more about the man all of Chicago feared. One afternoon, Adrian came to the hospital to sign papers. As he passed the third-floor corridor, he heard a familiar voice drifting out from the nurse's station. He stopped, stood behind the corner, and listened. Audrey was on the phone, her voice bright and warm. "Grandma, I'm okay. The new job is really good. Everyone's friendly. Don't worry about me, all right? Just rest and take your medicine, and I'll come see you this weekend." She laughed, a soft laugh like spring wind. "No, I'm not lacking anything. I've got enough money. You don't have to worry." Adrian looked through the gap in the doorway. He watched Audrey hang up, and the smile on her mouth vanished at once. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying before she made the call. He saw her sit down, cover her face with both hands, her shoulders trembling. Then she drew a long breath, wiped her tears, stood up, and walked out with a calm expression as if nothing had happened. He knew what had happened earlier. A difficult patient had just cursed her out because she'd arrived 2 minutes late. And he'd also heard other nurses talking about her behind her back. Yet she still told her grandmother, "I'm okay." She lied so Ruth wouldn't worry. She swallowed her tears so the only family she had could feel at peace. Adrian stood there for a long time, watching her thin figure disappear at the end of the corridor. For the first time, he saw quiet sacrifice. For the first time, he understood why his mother trusted this girl so deeply. That night the sky opened, rain pouring down in sheets. Audrey finished her shift at 11 o'clock, stepped out into the parking lot, and realized she didn't have an umbrella. She stood under the awning, staring at the white wall of rain, calculating whether she should run to the bus stop 200 meters away. Then a black SUV pulled up right in front of her. The window rolled down. Adrian sat inside, looking at her with unreadable gray eyes. "Get in. I'll drive you home." Audrey shook her head. "No need. I can take the bus." Adrian frowned. "The last bus left 20 minutes ago." "Don't be stubborn." Audrey hesitated, then opened the door and climbed in. The car was warm and smelled of expensive leather. They rode in silence as the vehicle moved through slick, rain-washed streets. Adrian didn't speak, eyes fixed ahead. Audrey didn't speak either, hands resting in her lap, tense. Then Adrian broke the silence. "You're doing well. Management told me." Audrey turned to him. "I work for my patients, not for your praise." Adrian gave the smallest hint of a smile, one corner of his mouth lifting. And it was the first time Audrey had ever seen him smile. "Are you always this stubborn?" Audrey smiled too. "Only when I have to be." The car stopped at a red light. They turned and looked at each other, and in that moment, something shifted. Then they both looked away, as if afraid of what they might see in the other's eyes. When the SUV stopped in front of Audrey's apartment, she opened the door, stepped out, then turned back. "Thank you. For the ride." Adrian nodded, said nothing. Audrey went inside, and when she turned on the light, she looked out through the window. The black SUV was still parked there, under the rain, as if it were waiting for something. Her heart jumped, just once. Why am I like this? She asked herself. Inside the car, Adrian still sat there, watching the light come on in her window. For the first time in years, there was someone he didn't want to leave. 2 weeks after that rainy night, Adrian Blackwood sat in his dark office, a whiskey glass in his hand, long since empty, and he couldn't be bothered to pour another. He was thinking about the brown-haired girl with eyes that didn't know fear. He thought about her smile in the car that night, about the way she'd said "only when I have to" with that stubborn, almost sweet defiance. He was thinking about her more than he should, and it made him angry. Adrian Blackwood wasn't allowed to have feelings. Feelings were weakness. Weakness got used by enemies. 22 years ago, he'd learned that lesson when his father fell into a pool of blood. He couldn't make the same mistake. He needed a reason to push her away. He needed to find something ugly about her, anything at all, to prove she was like everyone else, just trying to use him. Adrian summoned Bruno to his office. "Investigate Audrey Bennett," he said, his voice cold as ice. "Everything. Her family, her relationships, her finances. Find out what she really wants." Bruno looked at him, surprised. "Boss, is there something wrong with her? I thought she'd already been vetted." Adrian ground his teeth. "No one is good without conditions. Find her real motive. That's an order." 3 days later, Bruno returned with a thick report. Audrey Bennett, 28 years old, lost her mother at 12 in a car accident. Father left when she was small, whereabouts unknown. Raised by her grandmother, Ruth Bennett. Graduated top of her nursing program. Worked at St. Mary's Hospital for 5 years. No criminal record. No debt, except her grandmother's hospital bills, which you paid. No ties to any organization. Bruno set the report on the desk and looked Adrian straight in the eye. "She's clean, boss. Cleaner than anyone I've ever investigated. She really is just a poor nurse with a heart that's too big." Adrian was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Keep watching." In the days that followed, Audrey began to notice something was off. The familiar black car appeared on the corner every time she left home. Strangers came by asking her neighbors about her routines, about the people she met. The old woman across the hall told her someone had come by to ask whether Audrey ever brought strange men home. Audrey understood immediately. She knew exactly who was behind it. That afternoon, Audrey didn't go to the hospital. She went straight to Blackwood Tower, crossed the lobby without waiting for anyone to escort her, rode the elevator to the 50th floor. When she stormed into Adrian's office, he was sitting behind his desk, not looking surprised at all to see her. "You've got people following me," Audrey said, her voice shaking with anger, though she tried to hold it down. Adrian didn't deny it. He stood, came around the desk, and faced her. "I need to know who you are." Audrey laughed, bitter. "I already told you. I'm a nurse. I saved your mother. What else do you want?" Adrian stepped closer, crowding her, his shadow falling over her like it wanted to swallow her whole. "I want to know what you really want. No one is kind without a motive. What are you waiting for? Money? Power? Or are you working for someone?" Audrey didn't step back, even though her heart was pounding hard enough to break ribs. She held his gaze, those cold gray eyes she'd seen warm on that rainy night. "Do you know what your problem is, Adrian Blackwood?" she asked, her voice ringing through the quiet room. "You've lived in the dark so long you forgot light exists. You think everyone is like you, everyone calculating, everyone using people, but not everyone is. There are people who do good only because it's the right thing. But you can't believe that, can you? Because if you do, you'll have to admit you've been living the wrong way for 22 years. Her eyes were red, but she didn't cry. She wouldn't let him see her weak. "I don't want anything from you," she said, her voice thick. "I just want you to leave me alone." She turned and walked out of the office, and this time she didn't look back. The next day, Audrey submitted her resignation at Blackwood Medical Center. She didn't explain why, only said she'd found another job. But Catherine knew the truth. She called Audrey and heard the young woman's voice shaking as she said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Catherine. I can't work somewhere I'm suspected every second. I tried, but I can't keep doing this." Catherine went to see Adrian that same afternoon. She walked into her son's office, her eyes blazing with anger. "What did you do to her?" Adrian wouldn't look at his mother. "I was protecting the family." Catherine slammed her hand down on the desk, making Adrian flinch. By hurting the person who saved my life? You know she's good. You know it. But you're afraid. You're afraid to open your heart to anyone. You're afraid of getting hurt the way you were hurt when your father died. She stepped closer, took her son's face in her hands, forced him to look at her. 22 years, Adrian. Since your father died, you've locked yourself in the dark. You don't let anyone close. And now, when there's finally a girl, a good and innocent girl, you push her away? Tears slid down Catherine's cheeks. You're not a monster, Adrian. I know that. But if you keep living like this, you'll become one for real. Catherine left, and Adrian was alone in the dark office again. He sat there, staring into nothing. And for the first time in his life, he saw himself through someone else's eyes. He saw a man who was lonely and cold, pushing away everyone who cared. He saw a 14-year-old boy who was still afraid, still running, still building walls so high no one could touch his heart, and he hated what he saw. 5 days had passed since the argument in that 50th floor office. Audrey had gone back to work at St. Mary's, the same hospital that had fired her before. They took her back at lower pay and with worse shifts, but she didn't care. At least here, no one followed her. No one suspected her. No one looked at her like she was a con artist waiting for her moment to strike. She worked, went home, visited Ruth, then went back to work. Life slid back into the shape it had before she ever found Catherine Blackwood in a dark alley, as if everything had been nothing but a dream. But every night, Audrey still thought about him, about those cold gray eyes that had once been warm on a rainy night, about the rare smile that had touched his mouth when she said, "Only when I have to," about the way he cried when he held his mother, like a lost child who'd finally found the road home. She was angry that he hadn't trusted her, but she was also sad. Sad for a man who'd lived inside suspicion for 22 years, unable to believe anyone, unable to open his heart to anyone. On the 5th night, rain came down again. Audrey finished her shift at 10 o'clock, stepped out of St. Mary's, and stood under the awning waiting for the rain to ease. She didn't have an umbrella, as usual. She was calculating whether she should run for the bus stop when she saw a figure standing across the street. Through the white curtain of rain, she recognized him immediately. Adrian Blackwood stood there, alone, no umbrella, no car, no entourage. His black coat was soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead, but he stayed right there, looking at her. Audrey meant to turn away, but her legs didn't listen. She stepped out from under the awning, crossed the street, and stopped in front of him. Rain hit her shoulders, bitter cold, but she didn't care. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice colder than the rain. Adrian looked at her, and Audrey saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not coldness, not suspicion, pain, and fear. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough from standing too long in the freezing rain. Audrey didn't speak. She only stood there and watched him. Adrian went on, word by word, as if he were learning how to speak again from the beginning. "I was wrong. I suspected you without reason. I had people follow you. I hurt you, and I'm sorry." Audrey gave a bitter little laugh. "Then why? You said it yourself. You needed to know who I was. You investigated me. You know everything about me. So why didn't you trust me?" Adrian fell silent for a long time. Rain kept falling, soaking them both, but neither of them moved. Then he spoke, so quietly Audrey had to lean in to catch it. "I was afraid." Audrey frowned. "Afraid of what? I'm just a poor nurse. I don't have anything you should be afraid of." Adrian lifted his head and looked straight into her eyes, and for the first time she saw him truly as himself. No mask, no walls, just a man trembling in the cold rain. "I'm afraid of you, Audrey. Afraid of what you make me feel." Audrey stood there, her heart skipping a beat. Adrian kept going, as if once he'd opened his mouth he couldn't stop. 22 years. Since my father died, I haven't allowed myself to be weak. Feelings are weakness. Anyone who matters to me becomes a target for my enemies. I lost my father because of that. I almost lost my mother because of that. I didn't want to drag you into my dangerous world. I thought if I found something ugly about you, I'd have a reason to push you away. But you're clean, you're pure, you're better than anyone I've ever met. And that scares me more." Audrey didn't know what to say. She looked at the man in front of her, the Mafia boss all of Chicago feared, standing drenched in rain, apologizing like a boy who'd done wrong. She let out a breath, then did something that surprised even her. She took the knit cap off her own head and put it on his. It looked ridiculous, a cheap knit cap on the head of a billionaire, but at least it shielded him from the rain. "Come inside," she said. "You're going to catch a cold." Adrian stared at her, his eyes widening slightly. "You forgive me?" Audrey shook her head. "I don't know. I need time." She looked at him, and her voice softened a little. "But I don't hate you anymore." Adrian looked at her, and for the first time in 5 days he felt like he could breathe. "That's a start," he said. They stood there a little longer, in the rain and the dim glow of the streetlights. Two people from two different worlds, both soaked through, both shivering, and neither of them wanting to be the first to walk away. 2 weeks after that rainy night, things began to shift, slowly, almost quietly. Audrey returned to Blackwood Medical Center at Adrian's request, and this time no one followed her anymore. They saw each other more often, sometimes at the hospital, sometimes over lunches with Catherine. Their relationship was still cautious, like two people learning how to trust from the beginning, but something between them was warming, little by little. Adrian no longer looked at her with suspicion, and Audrey began to catch glimpses of the real man behind his cold shell. That Saturday night, Catherine invited Audrey to the Blackwood mansion for dinner, just a family meal, she said over the phone, her voice warm the way a mother calls her daughter home. Audrey agreed, even though she was nervous. She had never been to the Blackwood estate before. The place, people whispered, held more secrets than a cemetery. The Blackwood mansion sat on a hill on the north shore, surrounded by tall walls and ancient trees. When the car Bruno drove carried Audrey through the gates, she couldn't help holding her breath at the sheer grandeur of it. The house was bigger than the entire apartment building where she lived, with towering windows and golden light spilling into the night. Audrey arrived earlier than expected, and a housekeeper led her to the back garden to wait. "Mrs. Catherine will be down soon," the housekeeper said, then disappeared. Audrey wandered through the vast garden, watching roses in bloom under moonlight. Then she heard shouting, coming from the small outbuilding at the far end of the grounds. A man's voice, screaming in pain. Her heart clenched. What was happening? Was someone hurt? The nurse in her woke up on instinct, and she ran toward the sound, thinking someone might need help. The door to the outbuilding was cracked open. Audrey crept closer, worried for the safety of whoever was inside. But when she looked through the narrow gap, she wished she hadn't. Adrian stood in the middle of the room, his white shirt speckled with blood. In front of him, a man was tied to a chair, his face swollen, blood running from his nose and mouth. Bruno stood beside him with an iron bar in his hand, and Adrian held a gun, pressing it to the man's knee. "Tell me what Moretti is planning." Adrian's voice was ice, not a trace of the warmth Audrey had seen in him. "Tell me, or I'll blow out your other knee," the man moaned and begged. Then the gun fired. A scream ripped through the room. Blood sprayed, dark red against the concrete floor. Audrey clapped a hand over her mouth to trap her own scream. She stumbled backward, legs shaking, and bumped a plant pot by the door. The sound rang out in the sudden stillness. Adrian lifted his head, his eyes snapping toward the doorway, and he saw her. Their eyes met through the narrow crack. Audrey saw fear in his gaze, not fear of being caught, but fear that she was seeing the truth of him. She turned and ran. Audrey ran through the garden without knowing where she was going, only needing to get away. Tears streamed down her cheeks. The image of Adrian with the gun in his hand, blood on his shirt, his cold voice as he tortured that man, it chased her like a nightmare. This was who he really was. This was his real world, and she had been naive enough to think she could belong in it. Catherine found her sitting on a stone bench in a far corner of the garden, trembling. Catherine pulled her close and stroked her hair the way you soothe a child. "You saw something, didn't you?" she asked gently. Audrey nodded, unable to speak. Catherine let out a tired breath. "I know. I hate violence. I've argued with Adrian about this for 20 years. She held Audrey's hand, her voice lowering. "But you need to understand. That man is one of Moretti's enforcers. He tried to kidnap me last week. If Adrian hadn't stopped him, I wouldn't be sitting here with you." Audrey looked at her, eyes still wet and red. "But he shot him. He tortured him." Catherine nodded. "In Adrian's world, if he doesn't do that, the enemy kills all of us. It's a game he didn't choose, but he has to play to survive." She looked at Audrey with deep understanding in her eyes. "You don't have to accept it. You only have to understand it. Adrian isn't a good man. But he isn't a monster either. He's a man trapped between light and darkness, trying to protect the people he loves in the only way he knows. Audrey sat there a long time, turning Catherine's words over in her mind. Then she heard footsteps. Adrian stepped out of the shadows, changed into a clean shirt, but she still saw the faint smear of blood on his wrist that he hadn't washed away. He stopped a few steps from her, not daring to come closer. "You're afraid of me now, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low and full of hurt. Audrey stood and faced him. "Yes," she said honestly. "I'm afraid." Adrian closed his eyes as if the answer had cut him straight through. "I understand. You should stay away from me. You shouldn't get involved with someone like me." But Audrey didn't turn away. She looked at him, really looked, into gray eyes heavy with pain. She saw fear there too. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of being hated. Fear of losing someone he was just beginning to care about. She remembered what Catherine had said. She remembered the night he stood in the rain and apologized. She remembered the way he cried when he held his mother. "I'm afraid," she repeated. "But I also see you did it to protect your mother, to protect the people you love." She stepped forward once, closing the distance. "I don't agree with how you do it. I don't know if I can accept it. But I understand why." Adrian stared at her, his eyes widening with shock. "You're not disgusted by me?" Audrey shook her head. "I don't know what I feel. But I'm not leaving." They stood there in the dark garden under moonlight, only one step apart. Between them lay darkness and light, violence and kindness, fear and hope. Audrey didn't know what the future would look like, but she knew one thing. She couldn't walk away. A month had passed since the night Audrey witnessed Adrian's darker side in the small outbuilding. Their relationship had changed. It was no longer suspicion or careful distance, but something deeper, warmer. They ate dinner together every week at the Blackwood mansion, with Catherine, like a real family. Adrian stayed cold to the outside world, but when he was with Audrey, he allowed himself to smile. And Audrey, she was learning how to see light inside his darkness. That night, Audrey was having dinner with Adrian and Catherine in the mansion's grand dining room. They were laughing over a story from Adrian's childhood Catherine was telling, about the 10-year-old boy who once hid in a closet all day because he was terrified of going to the dentist. Adrian looked at his mother with mock embarrassment, and Audrey laughed until tears ran down her face. It was one of those rare moments when she felt peaceful, when she felt like she belonged here. Then her phone rang. "St. Mary's Hospital," Audrey answered, and her world collapsed in an instant. "Miss Bennett, your grandmother Ruth. Her condition has suddenly worsened. The tumor has spread to her heart. She needs surgery immediately." Audrey felt as if all the air had been pulled out of her lungs. "The chances of success?" she asked, her voice shaking. There was a pause on the other end. Then the doctor said, 30%, ma'am. Her heart is very weak. We'll do everything we can, but you should prepare yourself." The phone slipped from Audrey's hand and hit the floor with a dull crack. She stood there, eyes wide, seeing nothing. Ruth. The only person who had been beside her for 16 years. The woman who raised her, who wiped her tears every time she cried for her mother, who worked herself to exhaustion so Audrey could afford school. Ruth, the person Audrey loved more than her own life. "My grandma," Audrey whispered, her voice breaking like glass. "My grandma." Adrian stood up immediately. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to, because he saw it all in her eyes. He took her hand, his voice low and steady. "Come on, I'm taking you there now." They got into the car, and Adrian drove like a man possessed through the night city, running red lights, flying down empty streets. Audrey sat beside him, shaking, tears spilling without stopping. She prayed to anyone who might be listening. "Please don't take her from me. Please give me more time." When they reached St. Mary's, Ruth had already been taken into emergency care. Audrey ran to the window and saw her grandmother lying there, small and fragile, an oxygen mask covering half her face, wires and machines all around. Audrey dropped to her knees by the bed and gripped Ruth's wrinkled hand. "Grandma, don't leave me." Ruth opened her eyes, weak, but she still tried to smile when she saw her granddaughter. "My girl, don't cry. I'm old now." Audrey shook her head, tears dripping onto Ruth's hand. "No, you promised me. You promised you'd stay with me. You promised you'd see me in a wedding dress. You promised." Adrian stood in the hallway, watching through the glass, and his chest tightened as if someone were crushing his heart in a fist. He pulled out his phone and started making calls, one after another. Find me the best cardiac surgeon in the United States. I don't care where they are, New York, Los Angeles, or hell. Get them to Chicago tonight. Money is no limit. Over the next 2 hours, 3 top specialists were brought in on a private jet. Dr. Samuel Green, the most famous cardiac surgeon on the East Coast, came in person to perform the operation. Ruth was taken into surgery. The doors shut, and Audrey collapsed into a chair in the hallway, as if her legs no longer had strength to hold her up. Adrian sat down beside her. He didn't speak. He just stayed. They sat like that for hours, watching the wall clock bleed away minute by minute. Audrey cried until there were no tears left, and then she only sat there, hands clenched together, praying in silence. She's everything to me, Audrey whispered into the emptiness. If she goes, I'll have no one left in this world. Adrian turned to her, and he did something he had never done with anyone. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, letting her cry into his shoulder. You still have me, he said, his voice low and gentle. If you want. Audrey lifted her face and stared at him through tears. What did you just say? Adrian didn't answer right away. He looked into her reddened eyes, and for the first time, he began to tell her something he'd never told anyone but his mother. When I was 14, I watched my father die in front of me. He was on the floor, blood everywhere, and I couldn't do anything. I just stood there and watched him go. His voice caught. Since that day, I've been afraid. Afraid of losing the people I love. Afraid of caring about someone and then watching them get taken away. So I locked my heart. I didn't let anyone close. I thought that would make me safe. He looked at her, his gray eyes glinting under the hospital lights. But then I met you, and I realized I don't want safe anymore. Audrey stayed silent, tears rising again. Adrian lifted his hand and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. I don't know what love is, Audrey. I don't know how to care about someone the right way. I've lived in the dark too long. He looked at her, more sincere than she'd ever seen him. But with you, I want to learn. If you'll give me the chance. Audrey couldn't speak. She only squeezed his hand tighter, and they sat there in the quiet hospital corridor and waited. Between fear and hope, between darkness and light, 2 wounded hearts found each other. 6 hours. 6 hours that felt like an entire lifetime. Audrey and Adrian sat on the row of chairs outside the operating room, neither of them speaking a single word. Catherine had arrived at midnight, sitting beside them, holding Audrey's hand to lend her strength. The clock on the wall ticked off each second, and with every second that passed, Audrey felt herself dying little by little. She had prayed every prayer she knew. She had made promises to God, to her mother in heaven, to anyone who might be listening, that she would do anything if they let Ruth live. Anything. Then the operating room doors opened. Dr. Samuel Green stepped out, pulled off his mask, his face exhausted, but his eyes holding a glimmer of something. Audrey sprang to her feet, her heart stopping. She couldn't finish the question. Doctor. Green smiled, the first smile Audrey had seen all night. The surgery was successful. She needs time to recover, but she's going to live. Audrey didn't hear anything after that. The world around her dissolved, leaving only 4 words echoing in her head. She's going to live. She's going to live. Her knees gave out, and she broke down sobbing. Not the jagged grief she'd been carrying all night, but the sobs of relief, of fierce joy, of someone pulled back from the edge of despair. And then, without thinking, without hesitation, she turned to Adrian and threw her arms around him. It was the first time she had reached for him first. Adrian stood there, his body going rigid with surprise. He wasn't used to being held. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had hugged him, except his mother. But then, slowly, he put his arms around her and held on tight. He felt her shaking against him, felt her tears soaking through his shirt, and he realized he was crying too. The second tear in 22 years. Thank you, Audrey whispered into his shoulder. Thank you. Thank you for saving her. Catherine stood beside them, watching the 2 young people holding each other, and she smiled, the smile of a mother watching her son finally find happiness. 2 days later, Ruth woke up. Audrey had sat by her bed the entire time, never leaving for even a moment. When Ruth opened her eyes and saw her granddaughter, she tried to smile. My girl, Why do you look so awful? Have you not slept for days? Audrey laughed through tears. If you still have enough strength to tease me, you're doing fine. Ruth took Audrey's hand, weak but warm. I'm not going anywhere. I still have to see you in a wedding dress. Then Ruth noticed Adrian standing in the corner of the room, silent as a shadow. She narrowed her eyes at him, and Audrey suddenly felt her heart thump harder. Ruth knew who Adrian Blackwood was. Everyone in Chicago did. Who are you? Ruth asked, her voice weak but still sharp. Audrey hurried. Grandma, this is Adrian, my friend. Ruth looked Adrian up and down, then looked at Audrey, then back at Adrian. You're Adrian Blackwood. I know you. People talk about you. Not in a good way. Adrian stepped closer to the bed, not avoiding the old woman's piercing gaze. They're not wrong, he said honestly. I'm not a good man. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, studying him as if she were reading every thought inside his head. Then she spoke, her voice softer. How long have you been here? Adrian didn't understand the question. Ma'am? Ruth pointed at the chair by the bed, where a blanket was neatly folded and a pillow lay waiting. The nurse told me a man has been sitting here for 2 days, not leaving, taking care of my granddaughter when she fell asleep from exhaustion. She turned to Audrey. Was that you? Adrian didn't answer, but his silence was the answer. Ruth watched him, then watched the way he watched Audrey, the way his eyes softened when her granddaughter smiled, the way he moved closer without thinking when Audrey coughed from days without sleep. You look at my granddaughter like she's your whole world, Ruth said, her voice catching. Adrian looked startled. How do I look at her? Ruth smiled, the smile of someone who had lived long enough to see through people, the way my husband looked at me once. Like if you lose her, you'll lose your whole world. Ruth reached for Adrian's hand, her wrinkled palm warm around his. Good or bad? I don't know, and I don't care what people say about you. I only know one thing. You love my girl for real, and that's enough for me. That night, after Ruth had fallen asleep again, and Catherine had gone back to the mansion to rest, Audrey and Adrian sat on a bench in the hospital corridor. The lights were dim, the air quiet except for the soft beeps drifting from patient rooms. Audrey leaned her head against Adrian's shoulder, exhausted but calm. Thank you, she said, for what felt like the 100th time in 2 days. For everything. Adrian looked down at her. Don't thank me. I did it because I wanted to. Audrey lifted her face and looked into his eyes. You said you want to learn how to love. Did you mean it? Adrian didn't answer with words. He looked at her, at the brown eyes shining under the lights, at the loose strands of hair on her forehead, at lips a little dry from days of forgetting herself. Then he leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers. Their first kiss, gentle, hesitant, like two people learning how to love from the beginning, but real, realer than anything Adrian had done in his life. When they pulled apart, Audrey looked at him, her cheeks flushed. You still didn't answer my question. Adrian smiled, that rare smile only she ever got to see. I've never meant anything more. They sat there hand in hand in the quiet hospital corridor, two people from two different worlds, finding each other between darkness and light. Audrey didn't know what the future would hold. She didn't know whether she could live in Adrian's world, but she knew one thing. Right now, here, she wanted to be with him, and that was enough. 2 weeks had passed since their first kiss in the hospital corridor. Ruth was recovering well now, able to sit up and talk more. Audrey spent every spare moment at her bedside, and Adrian tightened security around the hospital. He knew Moretti was still out there, waiting for an opening. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, but he didn't expect the enemy to strike so soon. That afternoon, Adrian was sitting in his office at Blackwood Tower when his phone rang. An unknown number. He answered, and the voice on the other end turned his blood to ice. Blackwood Jr. It's been a long time. Frank Moretti. The same voice as 22 years ago, cold and mocking. Adrian clenched the phone so hard his knuckles whitened, forcing down the rage rising in his chest. Moretti. What do you want? Moretti laughed, a rasp like a crow's call. I just want to remind you of something. 22 years ago, your father thought he was untouchable. He thought no one would dare lay a hand on the Blackwood family, and you know what happened next. Adrian bared his teeth, the image of his father collapsing into blood on white marble flashing sharp and brutal in his mind. The gunshot, his mother's scream, the spreading stain, and the man standing there, smiling. You killed my father. Adrian said, his voice trembling from the effort of holding back fury. Moretti gave a theatrical sigh. I only took advantage of an opportunity. Business, you understand. And now I see you've got a new weakness. His voice dropped, thick with threat. That brown-haired girl, that poor little nurse you're in love with, she matters to you, doesn't she? Adrian shot to his feet, the office chair crashing backward. Touch her and I'll Moretti cut him off, his tone turning glacial. You'll what? Kill me. Plenty have tried, Blackwood Jr. They all failed. He gave a short, contemptuous laugh. We'll see each other soon. Then he hung up. Adrian lost control. He swept his arm across the desk, sending everything flying, papers scattering like wounded birds, a coffee cup shattering, a laptop hitting the floor with a harsh crack. He punched the wall, once, twice, 3 times, until his fist bled. Bruno rushed in, staring at the wreckage with alarm. Boss, what happened? Adrian whipped around, his eyes red like an animal's. Double the protection on Audrey and Ruth. Immediately, Moretti's about to move, but it was already too late. At the same time, at Street, Mary's shift change was underway. The most chaotic time of day. When the morning nurses handed off to the afternoon nurses. When security rotated. When attention splintered in every direction. Taking advantage of a coordinated distraction, a small explosion, and a staged fire alarm in the opposite wing that drew Adrian's primary security team away, 2 people in nurse uniforms entered Ruth's room, their faces hidden behind masks. Ruth was asleep. They didn't speak. They moved fast, wheeling her bed out into the hallway, into the staff elevator, down to the basement where an ambulance was waiting, with the guards occupied by the chaos downstairs. No one questioned the hurried medical team. No one stopped them. It was over in less than 5 minutes. As soon as the fire alarm was declared a false start and the chaos began to settle, Audrey rushed to Ruth's room, her heart racing with an inexplicable dread. The room was empty. Ruth's bed was gone. Audrey ran to the nurse's station, panic ripping through her voice. Where's Ruth? Where's my grandmother? The nurse on duty looked at her, confused by the urgency. She was taken for testing just as the alarm went off, maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago. 2 of our nurses brought her. Audrey went pale. I didn't request any tests. Her phone rang, a text from an unknown number. She opened it, and the world collapsed beneath her feet. A photo of Ruth tied to a chair, her mouth taped shut, her eyes wide with terror. Beneath it, a message. Want the old woman alive. Trade for the girl. Abandoned warehouse. Pier 47. Midnight. Alone. If Blackwood shows, the old woman dies. Audrey didn't remember how she got to Blackwood Tower. She only knew that when she stood in Adrian's office, she was shaking so hard she couldn't control it, tears streaming down her face. She held out her phone and made him look at the photo. Adrian saw it, and his face changed. Moretti, he snarled, hatred tearing through his voice. He kidnapped Ruth to lure you out. He wants you. Audrey nodded, forcing herself to stay steady even as her heart shattered. I'll go. Adrian spun on her. What? No, absolutely not. Audrey looked at him, her eyes swollen and red but unbreakable. She's my grandmother, Adrian. She raised me. She was everything to me before I met you. I can't let her die because of me. Adrian stepped in, gripped her shoulders, held her as if she might disappear. You think I'm going to let you walk into your death alone? Moretti will kill you, Audrey. He doesn't intend to release Ruth. He just wants to use you to hurt me. Audrey stared at him, tears sliding down her cheeks. Then what do you want me to do? Sit here and wait while they kill my grandmother. She pressed her hand to Adrian's chest where his heart was beating like a drum gone mad. I know you want to protect me, but Ruth is the only person I've had for 28 years. She raised me when my mother died. She worked herself to exhaustion so I could go to school. She was my mother, my father, my everything. Her voice broke. I can't live if I lose her, Adrian. I can't. Adrian looked at her, pain cutting through him like a blade. He knew she would go, no matter how he tried to stop her. She was stubborn the way he was, willing to trade anything for the people she loved. Fine, he said, his voice low and hard. You'll go, but I'll be right behind you. Bruno will lead the team and surround the area. When Moretti shows himself, we hit. He lifted her chin and forced her to meet his eyes. When you hear gunfire, you get down. You understand. Get down and don't move until I find you. Audrey nodded, trembling. Adrian pulled her into his arms and held her tight as if it might be the last time. "I won't lose you," he whispered into her hair. "I promise." Night fell. Audrey stepped into the darkness, heading for the abandoned warehouse where Ruth was waiting. She knew she might not survive, but she also knew she didn't have any other choice. Midnight. Pier 47 lay silent in the dark, abandoned warehouses rising like enormous ghosts along the edge of the Chicago River. Wind blew off the water, cutting cold, carrying the stink of rust and dead fish. Audrey walked alone on the uneven dirt road, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. She knew Adrian was somewhere behind her in the darkness. Knew Bruno and his team had already surrounded the area, but it didn't make her any less afraid. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid for Ruth. Afraid that by the time she reached her, it would already be too late. The door of the abandoned warehouse stood open in front of her, a weak yellow light leaking out from inside. Audrey drew a deep breath, then stepped in. Ruth sat on a wooden chair in the middle of the warehouse, hands and feet bound, her mouth covered with tape. Her eyes went wide when she saw her granddaughter, and she shook her head wildly, trying to tell Audrey to run. But Audrey didn't run. She walked straight toward Ruth until a figure stepped out of the shadows and blocked her path. Frank Moretti, 63 years old, hair white as snow, a bony face and eyes as cold as a snake's. Beside him stood Victor Crane, his trusted enforcer, the man who had attacked Catherine in the dark alley months earlier. "Brave girl," Moretti said, his voice rough with mockery. "Or stupid, I haven't decided yet." Audrey held her spine straight and fought to keep her voice from shaking. "Let my grandmother go. You wanted me. I'm here." Moretti laughed, the sound echoing in the empty warehouse. "You think it's that simple? You think I'll let this old woman go just because you showed up?" He stepped closer, looking Audrey up and down as if he were pricing a piece of merchandise. "Do you know why I hate Blackwood?" Audrey didn't answer. She only stared at him with hatred. Moretti didn't need an answer. "Because he killed my wife. Because he took everything from me." He shook his head and gave a thin smile. "No, Edward Blackwood was my best friend. I stood beside him for 20 years, building this empire with him." Audrey frowned. "Then why did you kill him?" Moretti looked at her, his eyes like two pits of ice. "Because of money, naive girl. Edward's enemies paid me a sum I couldn't refuse. That's all." He let out a theatrical sigh. "I've invented enough reasons to sleep better. I told myself my wife died because of Edward. I told myself he betrayed me, but the truth is I killed him for money, and I'll kill his son for the same reason." Audrey shuddered. She had met evil people before, but never anyone like Moretti. Someone who killed not from hatred, not from pain, but only for profit. A monster with no heart. "You're a monster," she said, her voice trembling but thick with contempt. Moretti chuckled. "I'm practical. Just like you, trading your life for this old woman. That's a transaction too." Audrey shook her head. "No, that's love. But you wouldn't understand. People like you can't." Moretti raised an eyebrow, amused. Then he pulled out a gun and aimed it at Audrey's head. "Interesting. But the conversation ends here. When Blackwood finds your body, he'll understand what it feels like to lose someone he loves." In that same instant, gunfire exploded from outside. The lights in the warehouse snapped off. Darkness swallowed everything. Chaos began. Adrian stormed in through the back entrance, Bruno and the elite team tight behind him. Shots cracked again and again. Screams, bullets slicing the air. Moretti shouted orders to his men, then vanished into the dark. Victor Crane yanked out his gun and aimed at Audrey. She stood there, frozen, no time to react, seeing only the black barrel pointed straight at her. Then Bruno appeared from nowhere. He lunged, shoved Audrey down to the floor, and the bullet meant for her tore through his chest. Bruno collapsed, blood spilling from the wound, but he still forced out words, broken and thin. "Boss, protect her." Then his eyes closed. Adrian roared, "Bruno!" The sound echoed through the warehouse like a wounded beast. In that flash of pain, he swung his gun toward Victor Crane and fired. 1 shot, 2, 3. Victor dropped and never got back up. Moretti tried to escape through the back door, firing wildly behind him to slow pursuit. 1 bullet flew toward Ruth. Audrey didn't think. She threw herself forward, using her body to shield her grandmother. The bullet punched through her shoulder, pain like fire, but she didn't scream. She only wrapped Ruth tight, covering her from the rest of the shots. Adrian chased Moretti, the two of them crashing into each other in the dark. Moretti was older, slower, and at last Adrian took him down with a hard punch to the face. Moretti hit the ground, his mouth full of blood, laughing in a wet rasp. "Kill me, Blackwood Jr., like I killed your father." Adrian raised the gun, aimed at Moretti's head, his finger on the trigger. He wanted to pull it. He wanted to end 22 years of hatred right here. Then he heard Audrey call his name, weak and in pain. He looked over and saw her on the floor, blood spreading red across her shirt. And he understood. There was something more important than revenge. "No," Adrian said, lowering the gun. "You don't get to die that easily. You'll live, and you'll rot in prison until your last day." He turned his back on Moretti and ran to Audrey. She lay in a pool of blood, her face pale, but she still tried to smile when she saw him. "Ruth, is she?" Adrian gathered her into his arms, tears running down his face. "She's safe. And you're going to be safe too. I promise." He lifted her and ran outside where an ambulance was already waiting. Bruno remained in the warehouse, eyes closed, a faint smile still on his mouth. The smile of a man who had finished his final duty. The ambulance siren tore through the night. Audrey was rushed to emergency care, Adrian beside her, his hand locked around hers, not letting go for a second. They had won. Moretti had been taken alive, but the price of that victory was far too high. A month had passed since the horrifying night at the abandoned warehouse on Pier 47. Audrey lay in the intensive care unit at Blackwood Medical Center, where the best doctors had been summoned by Adrian to care for her. The bullet had torn through her left shoulder, missing a major artery by a breath. She had lost a great deal of blood, and in the first 3 days the doctors couldn't say whether she would make it. But Audrey was strong. She fought, and in the end, she won. Adrian didn't leave her side for that entire month. He slept in the chair beside her bed, ate whatever he could without thinking, refused every meeting and every piece of work. When Audrey opened her eyes for the first time after 3 days of coma, the first thing she saw was him, and she almost didn't recognize him. Adrian Blackwood, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, sat there looking nothing like the man she knew. His beard hadn't been shaved, rough on his jaw and cheeks. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep and from crying. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair a mess. For the first time, she saw him as ordinary, as a man terrified because he had almost lost the woman he loved. "You look like you're homeless," Audrey said, her voice hoarse from days of not using it. Adrian looked at her, and tears spilled over. He didn't try to hide them, didn't try to act strong the way he always had. He only took her hand, lifted it, and kissed her knuckles. "You almost left me," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't ever do that again. I can't live without you." Audrey tried to smile, even though every movement sent pain burning through her shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise." Catherine and Ruth came to visit every day. The 2 older women had become close during Audrey's hospital stay, sitting side by side, holding hands, praying together for the young woman. Ruth cried when she saw her granddaughter wake. She hugged Audrey even though Audrey was hurting, and she kept saying she was sorry, that it was all her fault. Audrey shook her head and told her she would do it 1,000 times over if she had to, because Ruth was everything to her. 2 weeks after Audrey woke up, Bruno Marchetti's funeral was held. It was a solemn service, with hundreds in attendance. From Adrian's people to ordinary citizens Bruno had helped throughout his life. Audrey was brought in a wheelchair, her shoulder still wrapped, but she insisted on being there. Bruno had died because of her. She had to be there to say goodbye. Adrian stood before the coffin and delivered the eulogy. His voice was low and thick, but he didn't cry. He had cried enough in the long nights beside Audrey's bed. "Bruno Marchetti," he began, looking down at the coffin covered in white flowers, "wasn't just my right hand. He was family, the brother I never had, the only friend I've truly trusted in the past 20 years. He stopped and drew a deep breath. He died protecting the person I love. He didn't hesitate, didn't think. He just moved and used his own body to shield her. That was Bruno, always putting others before himself." Adrian looked down at Audrey in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she sat in the wheelchair. "I don't deserve that sacrifice, but I'm going to try. I'm going to live in a way that honors his death, I promise." After the funeral, Adrian brought Audrey back to the Blackwood mansion to rest. They sat in the living room by the fire, Catherine and Ruth long since asleep. Adrian held Audrey's hand, stared into the flames, and said something she didn't expect. "I'm going to change," he said, his voice low and serious. "I'm going to transition into legitimate business. No more violence. No more blood. No more nights where I have to torture enemies in the outbuilding. Audrey looked at him, startled. You mean it? Adrian nodded. Bruno died because of me, because of the life I chose. I don't want anyone else to die, and I don't want you to live in fear for the rest of your life. He turned to her, gray eyes catching the firelight. My mother has prayed for this for 20 years. Now I'm going to do it. For her, for Bruno, and for you. Audrey didn't speak. She only leaned in and rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat there in silence. Outside, snow began to fall, laying white over the garden where she had once seen his darkness. But now she wasn't afraid. She knew he was changing, and she would stay beside him through all of it. Moretti had been turned over to the police along with all the evidence of Adrian's father's murder 22 years earlier. He would never see freedom again, and the scar on Audrey's shoulder would stay forever, a reminder of the price of love, of sacrifice, of the night she almost lost everything, and yet, in the end, found everything. 6 months had passed since the horrifying night at Pier 47. Winter was gone, spring had arrived, and life had changed in ways no one could have imagined. The Blackwood mansion was no longer cold and shadowed the way it used to be. Laughter filled it every day. Lively conversation spilled through the living room, and the smell of good food drifted out of the kitchen. Ruth had moved in to live with Catherine at Catherine's invitation. At first, Ruth refused, saying she was used to living simply and didn't belong in a lavish mansion. But Catherine only smiled and said, "Then we'll live simply, in a mansion." And so the two older women became kindred spirits. They cooked together, tended the flower garden together, watched films together, and told each other stories from the past. Catherine spoke of Edward, of her love for the man she had lost 22 years earlier. Ruth spoke of Margaret, the daughter she had lost, and the granddaughter she had raised with every ounce of love she had. They understood each other, because they were both mothers who had lived through loss and pain. Audrey wasn't a nurse anymore. She had become the director of the Blackwood Foundation, the charity Adrian founded to help the poor, orphaned children, and patients who couldn't afford treatment. She loved the work because it let her keep helping people the way she always had, only on a much larger scale. Every day she went to the office, reviewed applications for aid, met with struggling families, and watched the smiles bloom on their faces when help finally reached them. The scar on her shoulder was still there. Sometimes it still ached when the weather turned cold, but she never hid it. It was a reminder of the night she almost lost everything, and also proof that she survived and was stronger than ever. Adrian kept his promise. He gradually shifted the Blackwood empire into legitimate business, shut down the darker operations, expanded legal companies and hospitals. No more nights of torturing enemies in the outbuilding, no more gunshots and blood. He was still the most powerful man in Chicago, but now that power came from respect instead of fear. Moretti was rotting in prison and would never get out. And every night when Adrian came home, he was greeted by Audrey's smile, by his mother's laughter, and Ruth's laughter in the living room. For the first time in 22 years, he felt like he had a real family. One night in June, Adrian took Audrey for a walk in the city. She didn't know where he was taking her, only that he seemed secretive and unusually nervous. Then the car stopped, and Audrey recognized the place. The dark alley on the south side, the place where she found Catherine 10 months earlier, the place where everything began. But the alley was different now. It had been cleaned, lit by hundreds of flickering candles. White roses were scattered everywhere, and at the end of the alley, Adrian dropped to one knee, a red velvet box in his hand. "This place changed my life, Audrey," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You changed me. You pulled me out of the darkness. You taught me what love is. You gave me a reason to live, to become a better man." He opened the box. Inside, a diamond ring glittered under the candlelight. "Audrey Bennett, will you stay with me for the rest of my life?" Audrey cried. She cried from happiness, from not being able to believe her life had changed so much in 10 months. She nodded, said yes 1,000 times, and Adrian slid the ring onto her finger, then held her tight in the very alley that had witnessed their beginning. The wedding was held a month later, simple and intimate, just as Audrey wanted. No show, no extravagance, only family and the people they loved most. Ruth walked Audrey down the aisle instead of the father she had never had. She cried through the entire ceremony, but they were tears of joy. Catherine sat in the front row, holding Ruth's hand. two mothers watching their children find happiness. And Adrian, the man who hadn't smiled in 22 years, was smiling now, radiant, as he watched his bride walk toward him. That night, Audrey stood by the bedroom window, looking out at the garden bathed in moonlight. Adrian came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Audrey smiled. "I'm thinking about the night I found your mother in that alley. If I hadn't stopped, if I'd walked past her the way so many others would have, none of this would have happened. I wouldn't have this family, this love, this life." She turned to look at him. "My grandmother used to say, never step over someone who needs help, because one day it might be you who needs someone to stop." She was right. I stopped for a stranger, and that stranger led me to a family. Adrian kissed her forehead. "Kindness is never wasted," he said. "It just needs time to bloom." Audrey nodded and rested her head against his chest. And flowers sometimes grow from the dark. Audrey and Adrian's story ends here, but its message lasts. It's a story about kindness, about sacrifice, about never losing faith in people. In this life, we often pass by those who need help without stopping, because we're too busy, too tired, or too afraid. But sometimes one small act, one hand reaching out, one heart opening, can change someone's entire life. And who knows, it might change your life too. Thank you for listening to this story from beginning to end. If you feel it touched your heart, please tap the like button and share this video with the people you love. If you want to hear more moving stories like this every day, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. We'd truly love to know how you feel about Audrey and Adrian's story. Did it make you cry? Did it make you think about your own life? Have you ever met someone who needed help and stopped? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We're looking forward to hearing the stories from deep in your hearts. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Remember, kindness is never wasted. It just needs time to bloom. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.